Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Brian Daly, and on behalf of my co-chair, Christopher Roebling, as well as the officers, directors, and all of the members of the Union League Club of Chicago, welcome to the clubhouse. We are delighted you could join us for tonight's program. This evening's program is co-sponsored by the Union League Club's Education Subcommittee and Mark Arvin, its chairman. We are together honored to partner once more with our great friends at Illinois Humanities and the Great Books Foundation. Tonight is the third Great Books style discussion that we have hosted here, where we use a timeless text to help illuminate contemporary issues. Tonight also is the capstone of more than 12 months of programs held around the state by Illinois Humanities exploring K-12 education in the state of Illinois. We are honored to host this, their final program of this series. Now please join me in welcoming to the dais the Executive Director of Illinois Humanities, Angel Yasagari.
Thanks, Brian. Good afternoon. I'm Angel Yasagari. I'm the Executive Director of Illinois Humanities. Thanks so much for making time to be here with us this evening. It's a really beautiful evening, and I know that there's a lot of competition for your time, especially on such a nice night. Illinois Humanities is a cultural and civic organization that fuels inquiry and conversation about issues that are most pressing in our communities. For the past year in Chicago, Elgin, Decatur, Tams, Cobden, and Carbondale, we've been helping to shape conversations about the future of public schools in Illinois. We welcomed parents, students, educators, elected officials, and researchers for conversations akin to the one you'll participate in tonight. In fact, many of you have already participated in some of these earlier conversations. The series would not have been possible without funding from a few key partners, and I'd like to recognize them. They include the Spencer Foundation, the Grand Victoria Foundation, and the Chicago Community Trust. On your seats is a printed compendium. The compendium is a documentation of this year-long series, and it's intended to provoke more thought and conversation about the future of public schools. We'd like to especially thank Allstate for funding the printing of this compendium, and also for funding a youth-made documentary that you'll see a clip of later on in the program. With us this evening is David Woolwine, the Director of Reputation, Community Engagement, and Public Affairs for Allstate. Please join me in thanking David and Allstate. And as we close out this series, I'd like to thank a few Illinois Humanities staff members, Paul DeRica, Matt Meacham, Mark Hallett, and Elliot Heilman, for taking the lead in creating this groundbreaking series of programs with such integrity, generosity, and humility. Tonight's program marks the closing of the series in Chicago, but I hope it's just the beginning, and that you'll continue the conversation with your family and friends, with neighbors, and with your elected officials. Please talk with any of us at Illinois Humanities later if you'd like to learn more about how we can support you in that endeavor. Thanks again for joining us this evening.
Hi. I don't know where the mic, there we are. My name is Joe Coulson, and I'm president of the Great Books Foundation, and I'm going to be the moderator this evening for our discussion. The Great Books Foundation was founded in 1947 by the then president of the University of Chicago, Robert Maynard Hutchins, and we are celebrating our 70th anniversary year this year. And the reason that we are here, particularly in a dialogue about public education, is that even though we began as a gifted and talented program, a lifelong learning program for adult discussion groups, we now do almost all of our work in public schools with Junior Great Books. We have about 1 million students a year who participate in Junior Great Books in all 50 states, all in public schools. And we have for the last 35 years or so, been trying to champion close reading, critical thinking skills, and improving kids' reading comprehension scores on state exams through the Junior Great Books program. We're very committed to this. I'm very honored to be here tonight with such a distinguished panel. In the compendium, on I believe page 42 or 43, is the excerpt from the Hutchins text that we chose at the Great Books Foundation as a kind of jumping off point for many of these discussions. And the reason that we chose the text, the editors at Great Books looked at many articles, contemporary articles by journalists, theoreticians, and so on. We found that many of them, of course, did a very thorough job pinpointing one very particular issue in education. And we wanted the discussions to be wider than that. We didn't want to focus them on one particular problem as a kind of narrow focus. So we went back to our founder, Hutchins, and we chose this text particularly because he seems to be making a clarion call, though not in this particular quote that's up here on the screen, for the efficacy and the need for liberal learning or the liberal arts, those skills that broadly fall under the humanities, I guess, and the fact that that is the basis or the foundation for all other learning. And he makes a justification or a call for that, certainly. And at the same time, he makes a strong stand for the fact that those skills and the learning that we do in public schools is an absolute essential fact for a functioning, healthy democracy. And those were really, I think, the principal reasons that we took this text as a way to think about the role of the public school, the vital role of the public school in creating citizens that work in a functioning, open democracy with critical thinking skills that are necessary to make our way through the mess that we have before us. I won't editorialize any more than that. So that's as much as I'm going to say about Great Books and the reason that we chose this particular text. A couple of things that I just want to mention is that before we get started is that at the end of the program, we are going to take questions from the audience, and a couple of folks from Illinois Humanities will come up and grab a couple of the microphones here that are on the stage presently, and when you ask your questions, please just wait for the person to come to you with the microphone so that we can clearly hear the question. Right now, what I'd like to do is I'm going to start here with Amaya, and I'm just going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves very briefly and maybe give a sentence or two about what they do, where they are at this moment, why they're here. Please.
So my name is Amaya Pawar. I'm the alderman of Chicago's 47th Ward, and I'm here because I spent a lot of time in office working on issues related to public education, and I believe that public schools are the basic building block of every community.
Hello, I'm Laura Frevaletti with Allstate. My role at Allstate is to champion young people, and I lead the effort that we call Good Starts Young, which is developing the skills, social emotional learning skills and service learning skills in youth. And the reason I'm here tonight, and thank you for that privilege, is that I believe that public institutions or that the last public education that can help youth develop positive skills are our public schools.
Good evening. My name is Beatriz Ponce de Leon. I'm the Executive Director of Generation All. Generation All is an initiative to unite Chicagoans in revitalizing our neighborhood public high schools. And we believe this is important because neighborhood high schools are open enrollment schools. They're the schools that anyone can access. You don't have to test into them. You don't have to win a lottery. And they really serve students of all abilities and all backgrounds. 40% of CPS high school students go to neighborhood high schools. And to us, the neighborhood high school as a community institution and as a public education institution can really help Chicago to build strong communities and a stronger city.
Hi, my name is Patrick Brosnan. I'm the director of the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council. We're a community-based organization serving the southwest side of the city. We organize and provide services in 5 issue areas: violence prevention, immigrant rights, healthcare access and equity, economic justice, and education equity and education justice. And have developed, in addition to organizing different campaigns, we've developed our full service community school initiative, which is partnered right now with 6 neighborhood public schools, including our neighborhood public high school, Kelly High School. And we provide all sorts of different services in partnership with the school and bringing in different partners and social service providers to try to really address the needs of the students. And we've been organizing and leading campaigns around education equity in the city and in the state for the last 5 years.
Hello, I'm Peggy Davis. Is this on?
I don't know.
We'll make it work. Is it working now? Peggy Davis. I'm the Chief Program Officer at the Chicago Community Trust. The Chicago Community Trust is the region's philanthropic foundation. We cover a 6-county region. And we help donors carry out their philanthropic intent. We provide grant making in a number of areas, including education. So that is in part the reason that I'm here, but I'm also here because I was privileged to spend time on staff at Chicago Public Schools and on the board. And I have, like mostly everybody in the room, I have strong feelings about what's happening and what's not happening, and I'm interested in the public dialogue on this topic, so happy to be here.
We'll see if this works. It does. Hi, I'm Joe Bast. I'm the president of the Heartland Institute. I think I'm here for a couple of reasons. The Heartland Institute publishes School Reform News, which is a monthly tabloid-sized publication that goes to every state and national elected official in the country. It calls for school reform. There are copies on the back table there. I think the second reason is I've been co-authoring books with Professor Herb Wahlberg from the University of Illinois. Herb is sitting right there, grading me on my performance here today. And these books call for school reform and get into some of the high weeds of exactly what works and what doesn't work. And finally, I'm a huge fan of the Great Books and the work of the Great Books Foundation, and I brought with me the picture of Robert Hutchins that hangs in the Heartland Institute and has since we got founded. And I'm just a huge fan of his work and the impact that the Great Books have had on me and of course, millions of other kids.
My name is Bill Ayers. I'm here because you asked me to come. Thank you. And I'm a retired distinguished professor of education from the University of Illinois at Chicago and an adjunct professor in education at DePaul University. My last 2 books this last year, one is entitled Teaching with Conscience in an Imperfect World, and the other is called You Can't Fire the Bad Ones, and 20 Other Myths About Teachers.
Hello, everyone. My name is NAYLA HALE. I am a senior at Kenwood Academy High School on the south side next to Obama's house. I am here because I am the voice of the students that are kind of absent in the room right now. I'm here to speak on behalf of us and to talk about like what we need and how everything looks through the students' eyes.
Preach. My name is Lawrence Mentor, and I am also a senior attending Kenwood Academy High School in Hyde Park. And I am also here to represent the student voice, because you can't talk about the youth and you can't talk about education without the youth. So.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Todd Breland. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm writing a book about black politics and education reform in Chicago since the 1960s. And one of the reasons that I'm excited to be here is that very much informed by this history, I think there's actually quite a bit of consensus about what a high-quality school looks like. And the problems that we have, both in Chicago and elsewhere, is a problem of political will, not lack of money or other issues. And so I'm interested in talking more about what equity looks like in that context.
My name is Alex Kotlowitz. I'm an author and journalist, and much of my writing is about young people, especially young people growing up in some of our most distressed communities. And of course, education is a central institution in those neighborhoods. I also, like others, deeply believe in public education, and I think it's an important pronouncement to make, especially in these political times.
Hi, I'm Mary Beck. I'm the principal at Senn High School. I'm here to represent not only the other principals and leaders in CPS, but also the teachers, and to support the students when possible. I think a public dialogue about our public schools is vital. We live the reality every day, and the rhetoric that continues in the papers and throughout everyone's lives is, everyone's got an opinion, but then there's the reality of what's actually happening day to day. And the luxury that so many people and adults have in general about talking next year is really detrimental to a lot of our students, because they only have 1 year to be in kindergarten, or they only have one 9th grade year. And so as we keep, kicking the rock down the road, or whatever the analogy is, we, are really, the day-to-day is really what I'm here to represent.
I'm Carol ROSS BARNEY. I am an architect, an urban planner, and an educator, and I'm here because I'm extremely interested in what it takes to build healthy, sustainable cities. I'm pretty sure that it includes clean air, clean water, free education, basically the things that make us understand each other and able to live together. And I'm very struck by Hutchins' writing about why the whole community should appreciate education and not just the people who are receiving it.
Okay, let me just ask the audience, as some of you may have noticed, we have a gentleman here from the American Sign Language Association. Are there individuals here tonight in need of the sign language service? Okay, then thank you so much for coming. Okay, so the question that I would like to ask then, particularly in light of some of the remarks here, is, yes, the question has been, what should we expect from public education? And what can families do to help their local schools achieve that promise? But maybe we can place that question, that very broad question, particularly in the context of equity and within healthy functioning cities, communities which in fact value education. So what should we expect from public education, and what are the challenges around equity and around the sort of entrenched attitudes toward public education that keep us from achieving the goals that we desire? And I'll just open that up to anybody who would like to respond to start us off.
Well, tell you what, an easy way to start this is most people agree that public education exists to serve 4 purposes, I think. One is to give students the tools that they need as critical thinkers so that they can become lifelong learners. So number 1 is, and Hutchins talks about that in this essay. The second thing is we want to build good citizens so that we have a democracy and a republic that can extend. A third thing is self-sufficiency. We want kids to come out of schools able to have jobs and support families and support themselves, keep the prosperity going. And the fourth thing is to continue values from one generation to the next. So the adults want their children to understand their heritage and their history and their values, and at least make an informed decision about whether to embrace that or to move in a different direction. So you have 4 competing, possibly complementary missions for public education. Does anyone disagree with that?
But I do have a thing on equity. We have to stop talking about equity. Equity is not equal. True equity means you spend money and resources and you allocate them where they're most needed. And I think we've talked about this with Generation All. I've always been a critic of selective enrollment, magnet, and gifted programs because I think those are symbols of inequity. Meaning, if you walk into some of our selective enrollment high schools, these are like meccas for learning, and then I walk into a neighborhood high school, you can see how this perpetuates over time, where people are like, I want to send my kid to the shining mecca where there hasn't been investment in a neighborhood high school for decades. And so we have to start talking about equity as not being equal, but what it truly means is putting money where it's most needed.
Yes, I would just encourage the panel. I'll ask follow-up questions if I need to, but please respond as you wish to the person who just spoke.
I'd like to expand on the equity concept because I think when we talk about equity, sometimes we think about equity of access. So people say, well, we need all these school options and different choices because more kids need access to a variety of choices. But choices and options don't guarantee access. So in Chicago, we've developed a very robust system of school choice. We have selective enrollment schools, we have a variety of charter schools, we have special programs. There are a lot of choices, but which ones can students really access? Which ones are guaranteed? So in terms of equity of outcomes, what does it take for every student to have the opportunity to go through school and come out with those things that we just discussed about the skills that they need, the critical thinking skills, the love of learning, the ability to learn moving on in their lives? What does it take for all young people to be prepared in that way? That's what equity for us is, more about the outcomes than about the access to different opportunities. So neighborhood high schools are one way to guarantee that access. If you can make a good quality school easily available without lots of hoops to jump through to get into, then we're really giving our young people equity. We're moving in terms of expanding equity in education.
I think that most of us here agree that equitable education is what we all need and what's important for schools and students to thrive. But I think us, or me even, if should talk about what can we do to acquire that goal. I think one thing that we can do is options like this, where we're talking about the importance of conversations that start people to understand why it's important to have equity. But I think also a solution is having these forums in a more with policymakers maybe, who can actually enforce the beliefs and the changes that we want to see. And I think that we can work as a collective, you in the audience and also us here on the panel can work as a collective to actually make the change that we're talking about that we want to see.
If I could, I completely agree with that. The idea that these conversations need to be taking place in communities, and that's one of the things I really applaud Illinois Humanities Council, because we've been able to host several of these events in our community. So it's been great to kind of make sure that the community has a role and a place. And I want to just build off what Beatriz said, because I think that, in fact, the choice system that's being embraced by the district now, and for the past several years, and that's being embraced by our Secretary of Education and President and lots of members of Congress, actually does the opposite. It's moving us further away from equity. It doesn't only not answer equity, it actually is creating a system that is actually moving us away from equity. And how it does that in Chicago, because of the system, because of the funding system that exists in our schools, the way that we fund our schools in Chicago, the per pupil budget line and all these different mechanisms that we have for funding schools. And so not only the fact that there isn't enough money coming into the schools, but also the way the money comes into the schools, the decision that's been made about how our schools are funded. As the choice becomes, as there's more choices, that means necessarily, by definition, there will be losers. There will be schools that will lose resources unless we fundamentally change the way that we're funding the schools and actually increasing significantly neighborhood public schools. Because it's not going to just happen. People aren't going to choose the schools, and we're seeing that happen all over the city. Wherever there's been choices, people have actively chosen against the neighborhood schools. And the communities have suffered as a result of that.
Elizabeth, did you want?
Yeah,
just sort of building on some of these ideas, I think one of the things to say about funding is that historically, both here in Chicago and nationally, the various ideas of ways to reform schools have been intentionally decoupled from funding to make those things happen. So you see that with moves for desegregation. You see that with movements for community control. Here in the 1980s, you saw that with the promise and then lack of promise and follow through with local school councils. And you see that happening here too, again, with the sort of expansion of privatization. And to the point that was made earlier, as we increasingly provide more, quote, schools of choice, whether they be selective enrollment schools, magnet schools, charter schools, they've further stratified our educational system and made it more unequal, made inequities greater. And so I think not only do we need to talk about this like at the national level, at the state level, the state of Illinois toggles between 49th and 50th in terms of inequitable funding for public schools for the entire state. And that means the portion of the allocation that they're paying is something around 39%, whereas in most other states it's well above 50%. And that has a huge impact. But then, as was mentioned earlier, the way we're distributing resources within the system is equally inequitable, so that we give more resources to schools that have less need, and the schools that are the most needy are getting stripped dry. I'm on a local school council of a neighborhood elementary school, and there are nothing but zeros in our budget. And it's a school that I think when we have this idea of parents making choices, well, they're just not choosing the neighborhood school. This isn't choice being made in sort of an equal marketplace. These are choices being made in an equitable and designed as such inequitable marketplace. And to this point about, these choices, when we base our educational system on a market-based capitalist system, in capitalism, there are winners and losers. It's unethical for us to treat a public resource like public education in that same manner. Because whose children are going to lose? And in our schools, historically and continuing to this day, it's black children and poor black children in particular who disproportionately continue to lose, not because of their lack of ability, not because of a lack of effort by them or their teachers or their families, but because in fact, schools have been historically underfunded and defunded to the point where they're not given an opportunity. So not only opportunity, access, or properly funded schools to achieve any type of success.
Bill, you look like you were going to say something.
I want to echo some of what Elizabeth said. This week, the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy at UIC released a report called The State of Racial Justice in Chicago, and you really must pick it up. It points out that racial and ethnic inequities remain pervasive, persistent, and consequential in all aspects of city life, from employment to criminal justice. But in education, opportunities and resources are unevenly and unjustly distributed along the color line. And that's important that we face that if we're serious about talking about equity and justice. But there's something deeper that I think that influences this conversation about equity and justice. And so just two quick points. First, there's a great debate for the last 4 decades about whether education is a human right and a public responsibility, or whether education is a product to be bought and sold like a refrigerator or a laptop. If it's a product, you go in one whole direction, including all the choice things that we see. If it's a human right, then you begin to think of other solutions. I want to argue that education is a human right. Related to that is the idea that in a democracy, whatever the most privileged and powerful and perhaps wisest parents have for their children must be the standard that we demand for all of our children in the community. Which means that if the powerful and the wealthy and the political class send their kids to schools where they have a full arts program, where they have a full athletic program, where they have a limit on class size, where they have a curriculum based in part on pursuing their own interests, that should be what we're striving for in all of our schools for all of our children. What the most privileged have should be the standard that we're aspiring to. Second point, good working conditions make good teaching conditions, and good teaching conditions make good learning conditions. You cannot get good working conditions without the collective voice of teachers. It would be like saying in Chicago, let's make policy for firefighters, for putting out fires in a big building in downtown Chicago, and let's have the aldermen and a couple of newspaper editors and a couple of corporate leaders sit down and figure it out. I'm afraid that's a catastrophe. What you want is the collective wisdom and experience of firefighters to be in the room. So the whole demonization of teachers and unions has been a catastrophe for the enterprise of public education. Linked to that is when there are allusions made to the crisis in public education, you're talking about two very separate systems. Nobody's arguing that there's a crisis in Winnetka or that there's a crisis at Francis Parker. The crisis is in schools for the poor, schools for Black and Latino kids, and that's something that we have to also face squarely. Finally, one of the three pillars of corporate school reform has been the reduction of what it means to have a meaningful, solid education to a standardized test score. This is a complete fraud from top to bottom. It can be untangled in a variety of ways, but just to give you one example, Charles Goodhart, an economist from England, has developed a wonderful theory called Goodhart's Law. And the principle is that a performance metric only works as a performance metric if you don't use it as a performance metric. Get it? A performance metric only works as a performance metric if you don't use it as a performance metric. If your universe is you want good schools, but the performance metric is either a test score or sends kids to college, guess what? Everything will bend towards that incentive. And it may be a terrible, terrible school, but kids have been pushed out, dropped out, kids have called anything at all a college, and so everyone goes to college. The performance metric has overruled the universe you're looking for. We need to get away from that. We need to challenge it. And frankly, the privileged don't buy it for themselves at all.
Peggy, do you want to go?
Yes.
All right.
So I agree with most of what has been said, but what I agree with most is that we have to deal from a practical perspective with what we do today and tomorrow. And to me, that's the question. What do we do? What do I do? What do you do? What do we do individually? Because we can agree with the conversation, we can agree with the theory, we can agree with things that aren't working and how they might work. But what do we do? How do we get more people to think of the students in Chicago Public Schools as our kids? How do we get people to understand that to have a great city, you have to have a great school system and that it matters? How do we do that, I guess is my question, because we can talk and we'd probably all be right, but what do we do?
Can I jump in here?
Absolutely.
So we keep talking about the failing neighborhood schools, but there are a number of very successful neighborhood schools in the city of Chicago, and we can't forget about that. And Senn High School is one of them. Kenwood is one of them. There are many others, and it's because of the community support that we receive, which is what has helped. And I'll speak specifically for Senn. 5 years ago, our graduation rate was 47%. Our community, our aldermen, the people in the neighborhood said this is not acceptable. Last year, our graduation rate was 83.4%. I mean, we nearly doubled our graduation rate because of the support of our community and the investment everybody in our neighborhood, from the Chamber of Commerce to the aldermen to the real estate agents to just the neighbors down the street. There was an investment in our building, in the fact that this is a place that we want our students to go. And that was very important to the community. And that is why we are successful. I know Alderman Pawar is supporting his neighborhood schools, and it's so important in that sense that if you're in that neighborhood, your responsibility is to your neighborhood school. And so as much as we're sitting here talking, there are some schools that are not as successful. They may not have the investment, but that's also because the community is not making that investment. And so as a Chicago community, yes, we have to talk about CPS, but we can't forget that there are so many positive things happening when we rally around the small, or the smaller part of the community, I guess is where I'm going with that. So, go ahead.
I just wanted to also say that as the alderman of the 47th Ward, which is a north side community, Lincoln Square, Ravenswood, North Center, I get to talk a lot about my neighborhood schools, but I also have to then at the same time acknowledge the relative privilege from where I sit, right? Which is recognizing that if I've got Bell Elementary School, when there are cuts that come down, my parents raise $400,000 to supplement what happens. And there are other schools that are dealing with that, just as many cuts, if not more. that don't have the ability to replace those dollars personally. To me, as a politician, one of the things that I am starting to, I've been thinking about this for a few years now, which is we have to stop electing people who tell us taxes are bad all the time, right? That this really just comes down to money for schools, and we don't spend nearly enough, and that taxes are not a penalty for your success. It is a contract between you and your neighbor and other people in your society.
So in addition to, and we'll pick it up right away, but in addition to these suggestions then, and just working off of your responses, how do we then, let's talk more about what are some of the ways that each of us here individually or as a group can do to work or break down the corporatizing of education, the built-in hierarchies, the built-in capitalist prerogatives, if you will, that seem to be sucking the life and the justice out of public education.
Oh, can I comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah, at the risk of everybody agreeing here, I disagree with most of what's been said so far, and especially with my new friend Bill Ayers here. It's not the corporate influence over schools that's causing the failures for 4 decades now. It's the public sector that's been such a tremendous failure. We're not talking about the success of private schools, are we? Or private universities. We are 90 minutes away from Milwaukee. Milwaukee has 29,000 low-income students attending private schools using vouchers. Okay, that program started in 1990. These kids are literally transforming their lives. They're making a huge difference. They graduate, they go on to college. Chicago doesn't have a voucher program, and it's because of the cowardness of the governor and of the politicians down in Springfield. When the Heartland Institute got started 33 years ago, who was Speaker of the House? Mike Madigan. He's still Speaker of the House, and we will never have vouchers the way that a majority of states in the United States now have until we get rid of him down in Springfield. We have a governor who's afraid to talk about it because the teacher unions are so strong. I think half of the panelists here probably get money from the teacher unions, and if you don't, you should be ashamed of yourself for defending their interests instead of the interests of the kids. Okay?
So I need to correct you really quickly. When we talk about the voucher system and the success of students in Milwaukee, CPS is leading the nation in growth of post-secondary options for low-income kids, students of color. We're also leading the nation in graduation rates. We have the sustained growth that we have seen over the last 10 years in Chicago public schools, in spite of the lack of funding that we receive, is outpacing everyone in the nation.
How does spending per pupil in the Chicago public schools compare to spending in the Catholic schools here in Chicago? It's 2 or 3 times as high, okay? And the Catholic schools are doing fine. They have higher graduation rates and higher college placement rates than the public schools.
Here's the thing. No one would ever go to New Trier and say the success of New Trier is because of the teachers union. So, and then on the other hand, to say that Chicago public schools struggle because they have a teachers union or because a teachers union fails them, it just doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't use that analogy to say that New Trier is great because of teachers unions.
You know, I'll say the only place where the market and where programs like vouchers are being really peddled are in black and brown community, poor black and brown communities. Commoditization of education is not taking place in Naperville. That's not even on the table anywhere. And like vouchers, in addition, in Indiana, they've been a disaster. Indianapolis used to have one of the top public school systems of any urban city in the Midwest, and now it's somewhere, it lost like 20 points in the ranking, and it's all because of the voucher system. Municipalities in Indiana have abandoned the voucher system in Fort Wayne and a lot of different cities within Indiana. And this is Indiana. It's a blood red state. And it's because in those communities they've recognized that the voucher system is sucking away valuable resources from neighborhood public schools, and it's creating a false choice. It's not a real choice for children, and it's not a real choice for, and certainly in Chicago, it would mean an increase in order for us to have any public school system in Chicago, it would mean a dramatic restructuring of how we fund those schools. So we really need to focus on the fact that if we have a market, if we're talking about markets, markets imply profit. They imply profit. A market only works if there's profit, right? If there's a profit motive. And so then the question is, as we transform our public education system into a market-based system, who's making the money? Who is making money off that system? Where is the profit? And profit needs, if we really want to address this problem, as you said, how are we going to do this? We need to, there's a number of reforms. One is we obviously need an elected representative school board. We need democracy back in education in Chicago. We need aldermen, and Alderman Pawar is a great example of this, to recognize their responsibility in supporting their schools, because too many aldermen in our city have abandoned that. They've abdicated that authority to the mayor. The mayor has complete control over the budget, and they're just not going to be involved in it. And so we need to really push our aldermen to make sure that they really feel the heat when their schools are cut, just like Alderman Pawar had recognized.
More money. That's the solution. More money. Keep
No,
getting more money into it.
Teachers-
I know what your interest is.
The teachers union is a very important part to students in general, to making a better Chicago in general. We need the teachers to have adequate funding. We need them to have their rights as much as we need our rights, so they can teach us as much as they need to for us to succeed and to thrive. And instead of investing in vouchers for the city, we should just invest in our schools instead of investing in vouchers. Like, it makes more sense to invest in the public school sector and make the neighborhood schools and public schools that we have better than to just send all the kids to private schools. Even if they are on vouchers, why would we not invest in our own public system that reaches a lot more people, that educates the whole democracy to make us all better people growing up?
Let me add, the Milwaukee system has actually not worked, and it's absolutely false to claim that the Milwaukee voucher system has been a success. So there's two things that, since Joe disagreed with most people, especially me, I'd say the one thing I think he disagrees with is the idea that education is a basic human right, not a product, not to be sold at the marketplace. If it's a basic human right, we begin to build decent schools for all kids right in their neighborhood, where they don't have to figure out how am I going to negotiate a complicated system. A good school right here, right now. As Elizabeth said when she began, we know how to do it, we lack the political will to do it, and we need to find that political will. The second thing he undoubtedly disagrees with is the importance of a strong teachers union, the strong voice of the teacher. You know, this is an easy thesis, so somehow Chicago is the victim of the teachers union. These powerful people, Bill Gates and Rahm Emanuel, are victims of the teachers union. We can test the thesis very simply about whether teachers unions bring schools down. The states that don't allow teachers to organize, Georgia, Carolina, Louisiana, Alabama, have the worst test scores according to the standards that the corporate reformers like so much. Massachusetts, which is highly unionized, has the best of those standards. And you can do it internationally. Finland and Canada do very well. Every teacher's in a union. So it's not the unions that's the bugaboo. That thesis can be tested. And when you test it, you can see that you're wrong.
One thing I'd like to go back to, though, and I'm sorry, Elizabeth, I know that you're, but Mary raised this issue of what parents can do. This was part of our framing question, right? What parents can do to support their neighborhood schools. And we've touched on a couple of things, but I'm wondering if we could return to that. What kinds of immediate solutions can we find within the community for those neighborhood schools as we're trying to work out the larger political ramifications of all of this?
Joe, can I turn that question a little bit on its head?
I wish you would.
I think that it's really important to talk about the community, and I think it's a mistake to talk about the schools and not talk about the neighborhoods. These, as Bill mentioned earlier, we're really talking about troubled schools in troubled neighborhoods. And so if we're really serious about school reform and rebuilding our schools, we need to find a way to also rebuild these communities. Because I think you can put the best teachers and the most resources into these schools, and if you do nothing else in these neighborhoods, you'll have little effect on the trajectory of those children. And I think that's just absolutely essential. And when we talk about parent involvement. I think one of the things we need to do is when we talk about equity is find a way to rebuild community. I think that just seems so essential in talking about rebuilding our schools.
And you don't rebuild communities. You don't grow communities by closing schools. And that's something we all need to remember.
Just to touch on this point, and also the issue about parental involvement, I think these are operating at multiple levels. So what can we do practically, right? I think there are things that we can all do to pressure policymakers, both at the local aldermanic level, to go to the school board, to write to them, to call them, to blow up their phones, and same thing with our city governance at the mayor's office on a couple things. And we can start with the fact that there does need to be a radical redistribution of both our priorities and our resources. And that needs to happen both in terms of schools and in terms of our communities, because the communities where schools have been closed, the communities where schools are on turnaround or have been largely privatized are the same communities with high unemployment rates, with high rates of foreclosure, with high rates of food insecurity, and all of these other economic problems. So when we're talking about investment, it's not just investment in schools, it's investment in holistic communities. And we have the money to do that. This is a very wealthy nation, a very wealthy city, and a very wealthy country. And forget what the state says, they have money, right? So we make decisions about where our money goes. We could redistribute and reform the way we use our TIF funds. We could bring back the corporate head tax that was gotten rid of. We could talk about new streams of revenue via taxes, and all types of other things. But again, this requires us to have the political will to do these things. I think on the micro level, like I said, I'm on a local school council, and this shows up too in terms of communities. You say that in our most distressed communities, we also don't have a large amount of parental involvement. Well, the majority of parents that are working at the school that I'm a local school council member on, are working third shifts, are working security, are working multiple jobs, and can't get to school at any type of school time hours. They have grandparents and relatives dropping off and picking up their children. So again, I think it does need to be this holistic involvement. And for those of us who do have privilege and do have resources, even if you've made a choice not to send your child to a neighborhood school, advocate on behalf of a neighborhood school, whether that's at a local level, a state level, or a national level. If you have something to offer, offer that. Are you a teacher? Do you have some other types of resources? Give those things to your schools, and just try to get involved and encourage others to get involved and actually go in these buildings that we're seeing as distressed and negative and in need of all this support. And the other thing that you will find is, we talk about distressed communities. There's actually a lot of social capital and cultural capital in those communities that people want to be able to provide to their schools, but don't have the opportunity because of all of these financial and economic constraints.
Carol, Lawrence, and then Carol, did you want to say something on this question?
Yeah, I feel like I'm totally in the middle on this one. I'm not kidding. I don't believe that schools should ever be bought and sold. But on the other hand, I think when I look at a city, even if the starting point's education, if you make an overlay of where the good schools are and where the bad schools are, and then you make an overlay of where the good transportation is and the bad transportation is, you make an overlay of where good recreation is, good natural areas, good parks, and it's not one thing. I mean, they're wholes because we're neglecting all of those things. And I think one of the things that happens is you get in the weeds and you get a bunker mentality about, oh man, I have to get education, or I have to get parks, or I have to get transportation. And I think it'd be really nice if everybody could think holistically about it, because I think the conclusion that we'd have is pretty much in line with what a couple panelists have said. We have to dedicate more resources, and that we have the wealth to do it. So we have to basically take the wealth that we have and use it judiciously. I know that challenges the idea of individual wealth, but I think that we should be willing to do that.
Lawrence, you're going to say, yes, please.
As far as what we can all do, I think we should focus more on the qualitative impact that we can have, opposed to the quantitative roadblocks that we are encountered with. So in schools, no matter how much money and funding we're getting, how much resources are coming into the school, what's going to always stay the same is the people within it, unless they get fired, which is happening a lot due to funding. But the people are always going to stay the same within the building. That means we need to focus on the quality of those people. That's the teachers, that's the janitorial staff, that's the students, that's the parents, everyone who's a part of that community. No matter what is going on outside of that community that's virtually impacting the community, we still need to focus on what's going on inside. Because I think a lot of times we're quick to go outside and branch out and try to network with other organizations that have things to offer, which isn't a bad thing, but sometimes we overlook the resources that we have within our communities, within our schools, and how can we leverage that network that we have instead of always trying to find someone else that can help us when really we need to start helping ourselves, and it starts internally with each individual. And I think that's one of the things that's been most valuable for me with my public education. At Kenwood, we have teachers that are really supportive and really vetted in our interests and supportive. They come to our athletic events, they're at our National Honor Society inductions and really picking up the slack outside of their pay. So after school, being available for tutoring, just being available, having their doors open, always ready for you to walk in and engage in conversation. Like there have been plenty of times where the printers have gone down, the projectors aren't working, can't get in a laptop, don't have a laptop, but we start conversations and how can we relate what we're doing in the classroom to what's going on in the world? How can we prepare our students to thrive in society and learn and experience in education, because high school is not just an education, it's not just academics, it's an experience. So it's your extracurricular involvement. It's that reinforcement from the classroom. Like most of the things that I've learned throughout high school, I've been through my extracurricular involvement, community service, and the different networks that I've established over time, because that's when you really get to apply the skills that you're learning, that critical thinking, to applying that to different areas that you will use in life. And if these resources aren't available through the funding, you have to make them yourself, and you don't always need the money to do that. You just need the right mindset. You need the like-minded people, and when you don't have the like-minded people, you make them like-minded people by being passionate about what you're passionate about and being confident in your identity and what you want out of life. And you can't have anyone tell you can't do something because you don't have the money to do it, because money is not what's going to stop you. It's about what you want out of life. So.
Can I add something as well?
Absolutely.
Think about what the role is for corporations in the city that we have, and the power of that collective voice, and the opportunity that corporations have to demand that where we all live and work is healthy and safe, and all of our citizens can be prosperous. So there's certainly power and motivation and opportunity from that voice as well.
Do we think, I'm sorry, please.
I wanted to just loop back to a couple of points. There is a lot of research about what works to make schools healthy places. There's good evidence about what high-quality teaching looks like. We need to invest in the educators, that's clear. There's evidence about how schools should be organized as social institutions and the kinds of supports that they need. We know how to do that. I think that CPS has implemented some of these over the years, and it is in part why some of our neighborhood high schools are doing well. Using research from the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research, we found that there's a measure now called the Freshman on Track, so if in 9th grade, and it's become nationally used, but Chicago started to focus on that. And so now we have a higher graduation rate. For several years, the district, in part with some support from the trust and other foundations, invested heavily in teacher professional development. They looked at national board certification. They looked at, in partnership with the union, they looked at the social science curriculum. They did some things that were system-wide. So these were programs and initiatives that really supported all schools and the educators in all schools, or many of them, versus one school at a time trying to refine what they do and make their own school better. And we have to acknowledge that there are systems, policies, and practices that really do make a difference, and that there's evidence behind them. So I think in terms of what we can do is that we can invest in those things that are supported by the research and by evidence, and that have an impact across multiple schools, not just a select number of schools.
If I can just say one more thing about what schools can do and what has been really impactful in terms of community coming together in schools. So as I said before, I'm the director of the Brighton Park Neighborhood Council. Brighton Park's been in the news quite a bit recently because of a huge increase in violence, and we had this mass shooting that took place a week and a half ago, and it's been incredibly tragic. But because we have been involved in our schools for the last, well, really since 2003, partnering with them through our full service community school initiative, because we've been working with the teachers and the administration and working on developing trauma-informed responses, because we have clinical services available to young people in the buildings. We've been able to use the schools. The schools have played an incredibly vital role in addressing the trauma, the primary and secondary trauma that students and families are fearing. We have parents that are volunteering on the street corners. We have parents that are working through the Safe Passage program. They recognize not only their role outside of the school and what we need to do as a community to try to improve and make and work towards peace, but they've also recognized the vital role the school plays, and they expect the school to play that role. And it's playing a role that a lot of schools, because we've been partnered them, because we've been bringing in so many resources, some schools in our city don't have that capacity. And that's one other area that we really need to start thinking about, improving the resources in schools and improving the way that we think about our public education and the role that public education plays in a city like Chicago.
Go ahead, NAYLA.
One thing I really want to bring up to the panel and the audience is that we should look at CPS as a whole and not necessarily as individual schools, like schools that are not thriving or schools that are thriving. When me and Lawrence, when we graduate, we're going to be graduating not necessarily from Kenwood Academy, but from a CPS school. So when we go out to the outside world and to our universities, we're not going to be known for being known from Kenwood, we're going to be known from CPS. So it's important that we're bettering CPS as a whole and not necessarily certain neighborhoods, certain neighborhoods, but not necessarily certain particular schools, because when CPS fails, the good schools don't thrive, we all fail. So it's important that we look at things holistically and not just, oh, Kenwood is doing good, so let's just keep investing in Kenwood. Like, if CPS isn't seen as succeeding or isn't doing well as a whole, then we all fail. So I think it's important that we're looking at things holistically, and also going back to the question of what can we individually do. There's a couple of solutions. First, you can join the local school council in your neighborhood. Kenwood has one. I think all neighborhood schools have one. So if your school doesn't have one, you can start one. These are open to the community. Principals are on them, students are on them, local community leaders are on them, so you can take initiative and join your local school council. Also, you can implore businesses to help and support your community school as well. I know for Kenwood, we have in the Hyde Park area, the stores take an investment and a pride in our school to actually help us and support us. And if you employ your stores and corporations and neighbors and everyone to actually invest in the school as much as if your student was going there or if your student is going there, then it'll make not only the community better, but the school better, CPS better. It's a chain effect. And that's just some slight things that you could do right now when you go home today.
Thank you. We've been going at it now for 45 minutes at least, and we're soon going to open it up for questions from the audience. But I guess what I would like to say is, before we do that, is there someone here on the panel who needs to get a last idea in before we open it up to the audience?
Can I say something?
Well, of course you can, Mary.
So I think when the students are speaking, it really sparks a lot in me. And I hear, as we talk about the teachers union and CPS as a whole, I think one thing that everybody can do is stop sitting back and watching CPS, what's happening in CPS as a sport. I think it's really important to recognize that every morning when you wake up and you turn on the television to find out what's going to happen, are we going to close, are we not, is the mayor going to save us, are they not, whatever it is, we're talking about those same news stories are what I hear every day, and that's where I hear it. And the students who are waking up every day to go to CPS, and the teachers who we put into this massive ball of the teacher union, but are individual people each and every day who are getting up and working for kids. There is nobody else in this room, unless you work for CPS, who wakes up every day wondering if their job's gonna be on the news the way that teachers and students and principals do. So I think one thing that the community in all of Chicago, I mean, this is kind of a big thing, but just stop looking at it as sport, start celebrating what is actually happening and the positive things that are happening, and then start supporting it. Stop talking about how horrific, or the violence or whatever is happening in that school, and start looking for, as Laurence was saying, the small things that are happening that we can continue to celebrate. Start recognizing that as we talk about the teachers union as one big evil being, as is kind of being recognized, we're talking about individual teachers who are educating our future leaders. And so I guess I'm kind of trailing off here, but that's the piece that I can really ask is start supporting it rather than just watching it and thinking that there's nothing it can be done, or it's just CPS being a mess again.
Okay, so thank you very much, and we're going to open it now for questions from the audience. I think we have to wait for here we are, they need a microphone. And there we go. And I'm going to let, you guys decide who you're going to go to here.
Oh, man, that means us.
Yeah, it's you.
Do I stand up? Oh. Hello, my name is Adara HALE. I also attend Kenwood Academy. And my question was, so I realized that we were talking about a lot of how we marginalize kind of what specific schools we're talking about because the communities aren't that great and the communities are in poverty and they're not performing well on these standardized tests that are supposed to measure our intelligence. So my question was really about, so there's this concept in Chicago where we're getting the money, like we receive money, but there's a mismanagement in the money where CPS doesn't necessarily get the money, and the money goes to the fire department or the police department, and I'm not saying that they're not important, it's just not necessarily equally distributed. So my question was about kind of what she was talking about with the evilness of the teachers union, and I feel like teachers make students and teachers make the curriculum, make students want to learn and want to be in school. And you were talking about how, in your earlier question, you were talking about how you want to talk about the schools that want education, but you can't really want something that you never really had or experienced. So my specific question was about the teachers union and the mismanagement of money, and how if we're letting our leaders, the people who we probably wrongly elected to be our leaders, how do we
correct that problem?
Yeah.
Okay. How do we correct the problem of that kind of mismanagement that's framed?
I think, again, as an elected official, part of this starts by, if we elect people to office who hate government, you're not going to get good government. So if you elect people who hate the institutions they seek to represent, you're not going to get the values that I believe most people have. I feel like we've lost faith in public institutions. And this has been a part of a broader agenda over the last 40 years. I think in big cities, I think starting with President Nixon, as a response to the Civil Rights Act, they started moving to block grants and started punishing cities. And we've started chipping away at public institutions, and we get to a place where you ask government to do more with less, eventually government does less with less, and then we gotta come and ask you for more money to do no more than what you were getting before because all these costs piled up. I think the reset button is electing people who believe in the institutions and being government as aspirational, where we want to get to, and the contract between you and I.
Hi, my name's Jen. I was a high school history teacher at Lincoln Park High School for 10 years. I'm currently on staff at Chicago Teachers Union, and I can tell you that I don't do any evil during my workday. Thank you to the panelists for speaking today to the room. I just thought that there was something that was unnamed in the comments earlier. And so my question is, how do we end our fear of naming structural racism and white supremacy? And so we know the patterns, we know what works, we know where it works, we know where funds go, we know why funds go certain places. And I think we've begun more often in this political season to name capitalism as a part of the equation, the intersection of oppressions. But we often shy away from calling racism and white supremacy what it is. So I'd love to hear people on the panel talk about how we name those things and how we connect them to the actions that we take, both with what parents we're speaking to and what students we're speaking to and who we're asking to speak on panels and how we get money and who we get money from.
So sometimes we wait for the audience to raise it first. It's better coming from the audience. You've raised a topic, and as you've talked about it, it is clear that it is a difficult thing for people to discuss, even believers. It's a difficult thing for people to discuss. So yesterday I was at an on-the-table event at the Chicago Urban League, and they were very brave. They took on this issue and they said, we're going to talk about race. And they had conservatives in the room, and they had liberals in the room, they had old folks, young folks, everybody was in that room. And the first question, they provided a definition of racism along the lines of what you said, structural racism and power. And they said, discuss amongst yourselves whether or not that exists today, whether racism exists today, and how does it exist. And so there was a lively conversation for about 15 minutes, and then there was a share-out. The share-out was interesting for me because there were a lot of political types in the room, and there was an opportunity for them to share their platform on race as opposed to what the table talked about. So I found that interesting, and we had this conversation today about listening. But at the end of the share-out, the facilitator said, well, I think we all agree that racism still exists. And then you heard this rumble from one side of the room. It's kind of like, no, we don't agree. So I said all that to say we have a lot of work to do on this topic. I think that we also have a lot of listening to do with each other, and to understand that we could be wrong about the way we think, that we have to be open to that. I could be wrong in terms of what I'm thinking about. I think it does start, though, with conversation. And so the Chicago Urban League is going to continue to have these conversations during the rest of the year. It can't just be one day. It can't just be one event like this. We have to start having these conversations on a regular basis. Why is our city the way it is, and how it can be better? So thank you for raising the issue. Just the fact that you raised it in this room, I think, is helpful.
You know, one of the problems we have, can I say a word, Joe?
Well, sure, and then we'll go to this gentleman's question. No, it's okay. Go ahead.
One of the problems we have in our language is that we use the word racism to mean two distinct things. It means ignorant, backward bigotry, and it means the structures of white supremacy and oppression along the color line. So you look at somebody like the owner of the Clippers. You know, he got in trouble for using the N-word and got driven out of the NBA because he was a racist. But for decades before that, he was a slumlord and nobody raised a peep. So which is the deeper problem? And I said in the beginning, you should get this report from the Institute on Research on Race and Public Policy. But it details in every dimension, but in education, which is what we're talking about, but also in criminal justice, jobs, and a lot of other things, it details the ways in which white supremacy is how we distribute resources and access. So it's not a mystery, it's right there in print. So you're absolutely right, but we should get away from saying, you know, we can all agree we're not racist because we're not ignorant like Clive and Bundy, but that doesn't mean we don't support an institution that organizes privilege and oppression along the color line.
My name is Kenneth Newman, and I'd like to know what this panel thinks about the numerous CPS principals and athletic directors who continue to violate Title IX more than 40 years after the law was passed.
That's a bad thing. That should not happen. I mean,
I was a basketball coach, and I keep promoting female sports. So I think the bigger issue is when there's no money, It's really difficult. I mean, the athletics in the city athletics in Chicago overall are incredibly difficult to support and sustain, regardless of whether we're choosing to support Title IX and choosing to support female teams versus male teams. Athletics in general, it's very, very, very difficult unless you have a beautiful field on your campus. It's difficult to support anything other than basketball or something that's within that you can do within your building. So a lot of the female sports, it's tough. And I think just athletics in general in CPS, it's tough.
I just want to give a shout out to in Brighton Park, I feel like we have a really great model of equity in terms of access to sports. And I know Kelly High School, we got a couple teachers from Kelly High School here. We have maybe one teacher from Kelly High School. And, you know, we're really proud of the fact that I think there's sports teams for both girls and boys, and they're both excelling, and we're trying to kind of really build the resources. And so I know it's a problem, but I think that there's great examples of where we're overcoming that.
My
Yes.
question I want to direct primarily to, Mary, as well as to anybody else who wants to address it. But you started speaking earlier about the success of CPS and how CPS is outpacing the country on a number of levels. And I would like you to continue whatever you were whatever you started there. But my question really has to do with why is there so little interest? Why is there so little political will around hearing about those kinds of successes? And I ask this question as someone who is a product of CPS and the daughter of a career CPS educator, so I applaud our educator who is in the house tonight. But why is there so little interest in what CPS does accomplish?
I don't think I can answer that. I mean, I think that's up to everybody who's in the room. Why are people not interested, right? It's a lot more interesting to look at what's negative and what's not happening. I mean, what we're doing with our graduation rates, we've had national media attention for the last 2 months, 3 months. Every time I leave the city and I meet other educators, they know what we're doing here. And I think some of the researchers and some of the people on the panel can speak to that too. What we're doing with the support of the consortium and with the support of the boards, believe it or not, with CPS, and the way that we're approaching our systemic change, it really is changing trajectories of students' lives every day. And maybe that's because that's what we're supposed to do. Nobody wants to talk about it. I can't say why people aren't interested in it. I think part of CPS too is we're our own worst enemy. As soon as we start to make these movements forward and we're doing these amazing things that are being nationally recognized, we're overshadowed by something else or by a larger political sphere, right? And so maybe that's part of it. I think we get a lot of celebration. Our alderman celebrates us. We try to promote ourselves, but it's hard to talk about when what you're doing well sometimes too.
I'd like to add to that. Yeah. I think nationally, we have this drama about our failing school system, and the country, in order to move in the direction of market-based school reform, we had to say that. We had to say that our public schools are crumbling, that the teachers are corrupt, that the system doesn't work, because then that opened the door to creating new schools, a shiny new school that is innovative and different, and that people will choose over the existing public school system. In Chicago, the 2010 movement, the goal was to open 100 new schools, and we pretty much met that goal. And I think, on the surface, it seemed like a good idea. But opening 100 new schools in such a short period really diverted resources away from our existing school system. So while there may have been some good innovation and there may be some good opportunities that came of that, it really continued to support that narrative that our existing public school system is failing. So now that the pendulum is kind of swinging back to saying, wait, what about our existing public schools, and how are we guaranteeing that students have access to good neighborhood schools? The narrative has to change, and so those stories have to be shared more publicly, and people have to show more of an interest. The media has a role to play in that. I think our reporting in Chicago is beginning to cover good stories about neighborhood schools and about public school system in general. There is still lots of room for improvement in our public system, but we have to begin to share those stories in a larger way. And spaces like the Union League Club, the Civic Committee, the Economic Club, World Business Chicago, that might not really think of our public system as thriving or as changing or as improving, those spaces have to have these kinds of discussions where people who are either students or educators or parents can come and share the successes that are happening at their schools. So there's a push to move in the direction of changing that narrative.
Hello, my name is Frank Lattin. I'm founder of the West Side Media Project, and we are an organization that works in neighborhood schools for the last 10 years. So about this narrative, I think you're right, there's a lot of great things going on in neighborhood schools, but that doesn't get reported. So it leads us to think, what is the narrative? What do people want to hear about those schools? It doesn't fit the narrative to talk about successes on the South and West Side. So that's part of the problem, but to the schools, when you think about the schools that was brought up earlier, the communities, how can you talk about the schools if you're not talking about the communities? And how can you talk about these communities if you're not talking about the history of these communities? It's like what we're seeing today in these neighborhoods is the remnants of white flight, redlining. Those policies today is, you know, you can see this in these schools. When you're talking about neighborhood schools, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell schools that have more affluent on other areas of the city are going to be ahead of these neighborhood schools. But we tend to look at the current population and blame it on them, when these are policies that were above parents, teachers. These are government policies, educational policies that led to what we see on the South and the West Side. So can someone address the historical perspective of what got us to this point? We know where we are, but how do we get to this point?
So I think a number of things, and many of which you just mentioned, have gotten us to this point. And I like to think about it as two parallel tracks of histories, particularly if you're mentioning large portions of the South and West Side that are Black communities in the city of Chicago. And so from the very beginning, you see racial segregation as a fundamental part of the way in which the city was structured. As we were saying, that this is intentional. This was done by individuals as policymakers, also by broad, both economic policies, housing policies implemented by public officials with corroboration and collaboration with large corporations, real estate interests that have created these circumstances. On the other hand, I think the other and very much important history to talk about in these very same communities are long histories of community organizing and struggle against these policies. Community organizing and struggle to create alternatives within these communities, so that you see a massive boycott of Chicago public schools in 1963, where 250,000 students stayed home from school to try to desegregate the Chicago public schools. You see efforts to create community control of schools in neighborhoods like Woodlawn on the south side of Chicago. A short period of time when there actually was some movement in implementing community control in these communities before that power was then snatched back away from the community. So I think it's important, again, for us to put these parallel histories together and to understand that the phase that we're in now is just one of many episodes of the constant efforts to reform and change. But as I said when I opened, and I want to stress this again, each of these moments that I've mentioned, where there are these attempts to reform Chicago public schools, have been decoupled from the funding to actually implement and do those things. So the parts that people hear and want to pick up on are the various ways to change management or organizational management of schools, to shuffle students around to different buildings and see if that will make a change. But fundamentally, creating equitable, and I appreciate your point, not equal, but equitable funding, based on level of need in the communities of greatest need, has never been accompanied with these various efforts. So I think it's important to recognize how we got here, to recognize that there are histories of struggle and pushback at every level against these policies, so that we also have motivation to keep that going as well.
How many more questions? I need to ask the, sure, that's fine, but how many more questions do you think we can take? 3 more? Okay, please.
I wish to compliment the young people from Chicago Public Schools, the 3 high school students and the very young principal for being so articulate and inspiring. And what a great representation of Chicago Public Schools we have in this room. Thank you.
This gentleman here, does he have a microphone?
I have the microphone right now.
Yes, sorry. To preface, I am a public school special education teacher, as well as a scholar in educational policy. The population I teach, they struggle to achieve what's currently considered academic success, that being standardized testing and college acceptance. How do we reframe what is success in education for those students who cannot do well in those two metrics?
We have a request to repeat the question, just the last part of it there.
I'm sorry, for those students, especially special education students who cannot do well in college acceptance or standardized testing, how do we reframe what is academic success for students like that?
So I think it goes back to the equity issue and finding, I mean, this is, I know it's been met with the plan that was recently announced by the mayor about every student graduating should have a plan when they leave high school. I know that's been met with a lot of criticism. As a principal, I'm not sure why. Our job as principals and educators is to make sure that everybody who leaves our doors has a plan when they leave our doors, right? And so I think when it comes to looking at students with special needs or diverse learners who are struggling in different ways, it's finding what programs will work for them and meeting them, and then finding, okay, well, what's your plan going to be? What can we do to educate you so that when you leave our doors, there's something that you can do that will continue your life? And whether it's bringing back more CTE programs, whether it's looking at different job shadowing or job training programs, there's a number of different things we can do. But I think it's a fundamental belief that, understanding that our job is to make sure when they leave our walls is so that they can become productive members of society, whatever that means to them.
Okay, and then we're going to take this question. I'm sorry, but I want to try to get as many questions in as we can. Yes.
Yes, I'm from the manufacturing sector. We're suffering from people who do not have the skills, not necessarily college-level training, but skills that we used to consider very, very important. At the end of the late 1990s, Chicago Public Schools decided that they were going to be college prep. And what they did is they took 26 machine shops, 26 vocational educational programs, and they were thrown out the door. Building on this last question, or this last issue, when you graduate from high school, what are you going to do with your life if you have no interest in pursuing a post-secondary education? This is really not a question, it's a comment. I think that the Chicago Public Schools have failed and are missing a serious opportunity by not reopening or revisiting the possibility of vocational education for which there are models. And there's a need. And secondly, the students want to be inspired. Why am I in school? Some people want to work with their hands, and that opportunity does not exist. Is it possible to reopen vocational education in the Chicago Public Schools?
Amaya is going to respond to that comment. Go ahead.
So something that I see coming our way as a society that is kind of scary, should be scary to all of us, is that our economy is sort of at this intersection between race and class and automation. And there are lots of jobs that are moving their way up, sort of from blue-collar jobs to white-collar jobs that are being automated. So we're going to see trucking that'll be automated in the next 7 years or less. So people make solid middle-class wages are going to be replaced by a computer. It's coming to the law, right? If you're a lawyer, discovery can be automated now. So to answer your question about what we're going to do, I think we also have to think about what we're going to train our kids in sort of the most basic skills, because I think writing, reading comprehension, love of the arts. These are the kinds of jobs that I think are going to propel the economy of the future, because lots of other jobs, because there's so much money to be made, are going to be automated. And so we have to start thinking about, when we're thinking about race, not divorcing institutional racism, but also then recognizing there are lots of really poor white communities that have been left behind because of manufacturing automating. And we need to do something about that in terms of making sure that there are jobs for people. We can't just have cheap products. And so I think manufacturing leaders have to also decide, do we slow down the pace of automation so there's stuff for people to do? Or do we just have universal basic income?
Okay, so I think we have time for one last question. Does someone has a microphone? They do. There we are.
Hi, thank you all for speaking today, and this is a combination of commentary and a question. And a little context, I work in university administration now, and I previously worked at the city of Chicago. I think one thing that is a significant problem is there are a lot of old school bureaucrats in the city at every level, and probably within the teachers union, within the government, the administration. My background is in project management, which looks a lot at waste and inefficiencies. And I think one area where the public sector could learn from the private sector, not necessarily saying private schools, but private companies, is to evaluate the school system, look at waste and inefficiencies, go into those communities, teach people leadership skills and management skills, because I think unfortunately the will may be there, but they don't necessarily know how to rise up and to help their community rise as well. So what do you think could be done to encourage spreading those skills and spreading that knowledge and looking at waste and inefficiencies in the school systems? Because no matter how much money you throw at something, if it goes to waste and it's not used productively, it's still wasted.
I'll take the first stab at that. I think that at least at the community level, the schools have been absolutely cut to the bone. There is no opportunity for waste because there's nothing to waste. I mean, we're talking about schools that have, kids are bringing toilet paper in. As a CPS parent of a neighborhood, I send two of my children go to neighborhood public schools, and our neighborhood public school, and we have, you should see the list of resources we have to bring in. And we work very closely with our LSCs and with the principals, administration, and teacher leaders looking at their budgets, and there's no waste. I will say one thing, ironically enough, in the effort to address waste, fraud, and abuse, the city, contracted out Airmark and what was the other one? Sodexo Magic, and you want to see waste, fraud, and abuse, goodness gracious. So in an effort to privatize, we've actually increased our annual costs. Maybe there's a reduction in overall pension costs, pension liability, but there's a huge increase in the annual costs. It's actually costing us more every year to privatize the engineers and the janitorial services, and my kids getting sick a lot more at public schools, at their school, because the school just isn't clean. We have parents that are volunteering every week to go and clean outside of the school building, and in some of our schools, we have parents actually volunteering to clean inside the school system because there just aren't the resources to do it. So ironically enough, as we've moved towards privatization, it's actually become less efficient and more costly. And I don't know if that's,
And sorry, I'd just like to say one more thing. I feel
And this
like
will just be our final comment. So you've got the floor.
Okay, yeah. I feel like it's something that I hear a lot, and I should say also it's something that frequently comes up when I look at archival documents in the record as well, where people constantly say, well, we can't just throw money at the problem, but we've never actually thrown money at the problem. And I'd also like to say that that's never something that we say about wealthy districts who have exponentially more money going into per pupil spending than we do in the city of Chicago. So I think that discourse is anachronistic and not productive to the actual needs that are there, and I think that's part of what you were speaking to down there.
Okay. And with that, Sadly, we're going to have to close. I want to first thank all of you for being here tonight and hope that you will take enthusiasm and interest out into your communities and look at ways in which both political will and direct action can be cultivated. On behalf of the Great Books Foundation, I want to thank the Union League Club for hosting us here, and of course, the Illinois Humanities Council for all of their work in organizing this event. And finally, I want to thank, of course, our distinguished panel for a provocative and I think amazing discussion. Thank you.